first introduce you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's always great to see also some ladies here. So the gender gap is getting filled over the years. Today we have a double feature. What I think it's quite good and makes me enthusiastic, because two very different projects, two different speakers, and very interesting. We have today the third generation blockchains by Charles introduced, and then the future of data storage powered by blockchains later from Vlado. Our first speaker, Charles, is the CEO and co-founder of IOHK. Charles is a Colorado-based technology entrepreneur and mathematician. His current project focuses on education of cryptocurrency topics, evangelism of decentralization, and making cryptographic tools easier to use for the mainstream. He was and is involved in Invictus Innovation, Ethereum. He was a co-founder of Ethereum, where Bernd has this very nice sweater today. And his current project is the IOHK and Cardano. You probably noticed in the coin market cap what came somehow out of nothing, and everyone was talking about, well, this is a kind of new Ethereum. So he will give us some words about this. The floor is yours, Charles, and thanks for joining us in Switzerland.
Thank you so much for having me. I really do appreciate it. So this was impromptu. I happened to be in town on business. I just came in from Vegas, of all places. I was in Vegas for the rodeo, bull riding and horse roping and all these things. And still got my boots on and everything. So I flew from Vegas to Colorado. I was in the airport for 3 hours, from Colorado to Chicago to here. And in Chicago, had a big snowstorm, and so the plane had to breach out of it. And I didn't die. I was really excited about that. So anyway, 22 hours of traveling. I'm here. Thank you guys so much for coming. It's humbling to see that I've gotten this big crowd in such short notice. Okay, so I'm Charles Hoskinson. Some of you know me. Some of you don't know me. For those who don't know me, I've been an entrepreneur in the cryptocurrency space for several years now. I started in the education side of things. I created the Bitcoin Education Project. We released a bunch of content, taught people about Bitcoin, and we went around and conferences and did YouTube videos, and the flagship was our Udemy course. We had 70,000 students for Bitcoin, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Crypto. And it was just a lot of fun. And I met Andreas, and I met Adam Levine, and a whole bunch of people. And that bootstrapped my career in the cryptocurrency space. And I eventually created BitShares with Dan Larimer. And then the one I'm known for is Ethereum. That's the Switzerland connection with Vitalik Buterin and the rest. But all those companies were like companies wrapped around a project. So we wanted to do something like educate people or build a cryptocurrency protocol. So we built a management layer around it, raised some capital, and went and did it. So IOHK is quite different. It's actually a factory for cryptocurrencies. So we're kind of agnostic about the future. We say we're going to build it, but we want to build all the capabilities that allow us to do that. So we have both a research division and we have an engineering division. The research side is embedded at universities. So we have professors and graduate students and postdocs, and we write papers. So we write papers on consensus protocols and zero-knowledge proofs and privacy stuff, and papers on new types of crypto, like quantum immune signature schemes and all kinds of things. And we currently have 3 research centers. One is the University of Edinburgh, one's at Tokyo Tech, and one's at University of Athens. And we work with about 24 different researchers, and all of our papers go through peer review or at least submitted. So IACR conferences like Crypto, Eurocrypt, AsiaCrypt, and other conferences like Oakland and so forth. On the other side of the company, we build stuff. We build cryptocurrencies. We make the picks and shovels during the gold rush. And so we have a very unique engineering philosophy. We build high assurance software. So what the heck does that mean? So when I was on that plane and I look at that jet engine, the jet engine's running a very particular type of software. And that software never gets the blue screen of death. It's been built in a very special way, so I don't die. And so why don't we take those engineering techniques, or the techniques that NASA uses when it lands a $5 billion rover on Mars, and put that and apply it towards cryptocurrency development. And that's what IOHK does. So we use formal methods. So we have things like psi calculus, and we use dependently typed languages, and you'll see this notion of like formal specification and bi-simulation, all these gobbledygooky words that come out. But at the end of the day, it means we can prevent bugs and things like that. That's a bit about my background. I'm an accidental entrepreneur. I didn't expect to be here. I didn't expect to be in this space. I was a mathematician. I quite enjoy math, but somehow I got pulled into crypto, and like the mafia, you can never leave once you're in. So let's talk about generations of cryptocurrencies. That's the sexy stuff. Less about me, more about where are we going. So when I started, we didn't have Ethereum, we didn't have smart contracts. We had this idea of that, but we had this thing called Bitcoin. Anybody remember Bitcoin? Bitcoin's pretty cool. Yay, Bitcoin, right? At one time, Bitcoin was like crazy revolutionary as an idea. I mean, think about it. It's like this spreadsheet in the sky. Who the hell knows where it came from? And somehow, some way, we just figure out who owns what, and then we pay for it. I remember when we first got started with this thing, people are going around buying stuff, not on exchanges, but on forums, and they were like negotiating over Bitcoin talk on how many Bitcoin to buy. And they would just use PayPal, and if you lost 50 Bitcoin, you're like, it's just 50 Bitcoin, who cares, like whatever. And then all of a sudden it got valuable and useful, and people started using it for stuff, and then all of a sudden they said, well, that's great, but it sucks. It sucks because our transactions aren't programmable. It's like having a web browser without JavaScript. Like, what can you do if you don't have programmability in your web browser? Not much. You don't have Gmail. You don't have Facebook. You don't have anything that you like, right? So Ethereum came out in 2013 as kind of a project of frustration, and it has a lot of stuff that was stolen. Like Sergio Lerner came up with Turing-complete smart contracts long before Vitalik did it, and Nick Szabo came up with this stuff long before anybody else did, right? And goddamn Wei Dai was talking about it. Before that, you had David Chaum talking about some of these things. So these concepts and these ideas were in one piece or another, but the basic idea was, let's have programmable transactions on blockchain. So take these things, put them in a database, make them executable, and then once you have them, you have some state and interdependency, you can actually do stuff with it. You can have bespoke transactions. You say, but Charles, what's an example of a bespoke transaction? So let's say you run a company, and you have 5 guys who are in your board of directors, and they sign for stuff. So it's 3 of 5. But let's say your guys go on vacation during Christmas. So you want to downgrade that to 2 of 3. Okay, that's standard business logic, happens all the time. Can you do that in Bitcoin? Man, it's hard. It's very bespokey. And can you create a custom transaction just for that, fork the protocol to put it in? No, but if you want a smart contract, it's really simple. You code it, you write it up, it's done in a day, and you test it. And that was the point, is that you have all these kinds of commerce, which you care about for your business and your application, which I don't care about for my business, my application. And it would be damn nuts for me to try to dream up this universal protocol that covers every possible business domain. I'm just going to do what we did with the web, give you a programming language, and say, go have fun with it and figure it out. That was the basic idea of Ethereum, and that's basically spawned this whole second generation. And it was great until it wasn't. Until we had the DAO and the parity hack and CryptoKitties and all these wonderful things. And what did that do to us? Well, it proved a few things. First, it proved that the software, the way we write it, is really bad. There's a great paper called Making Smart Contracts Safer or something like that. It was written by Loy Liu and a bunch of guys out of Singapore. And they created this tool called Oriente. And they ran it through all of the code that was deployed on the Ethereum blockchain. They found that more than half of the smart contracts had some sort of fatal flaw in them, 40% of which were as bad as the DAO hack. So like half of all software deployed on Ethereum is not really well formed. Probably gotten a little bit better, but the point is it's really hard to write safe code right now in these systems. Second, it's a replicated system. So what does that mean? So imagine you have a table right here. So here's a table. I'll pull this table out because I like props. Ooh, it rolls. Cool. Okay. So we have this table, and we have a pie on the table, right? So here's how replication works. When you add more users, you put more seats around the table, like that, right? Or put more seats. Does that make the pie any bigger? No. We all get a smaller slice of pie, don't we? And I like pie. I don't like it when people shrink my pie and give me less pie. And that's where we're at right now with cryptocurrencies. They're replicated systems. So as a consequence, if we go from 1,000 users to 10,000 to 100,000 to 1 million, they just start falling apart, as we've seen with CryptoKitties and all of these other wonderful things that have bombarded the network, or what's currently going on with the Bitcoin network. So our systems aren't scalable. Our systems are kind of blind and deaf. They don't really talk well to each other. Bitcoin doesn't really talk to anybody. Ethereum can talk to people with relays, but it's really expensive. It takes a lot of gas. And then you have legacy systems that require metadata and attribution. So interoperability sucks. And we live in a financial world with thousands of cryptocurrencies, thousands of banks, lots of protocols. There's never going to be one protocol to rule them all. Not going to happen. So you need to be able to talk to other things. Finally, has anybody heard of Ethereum Classic? Or Bitcoin Cash? Or Bitcoin Gold? I guess there's Bitcoin God and Bitcoin Diamonds coming out now too. I was like, wow, we're going all the way down the rainbow. So why does that happen? Well, it happens because let's say you don't like what he's thinking and he doesn't like what you're thinking and you just can't agree. So you go get your group and he goes and gets his group and there's no consensus mechanism to decide who's right and who's wrong and compromise. So we just go to Reddit, we complain, and then eventually we fork. So we end up getting more and more of these things and they become much more predatory with each other. So in a sense, these systems aren't terribly sustainable. We don't have governance figured out, and we also have a tremendous difficulty paying for things without having to go and do a token offering. So anybody heard of an ICO? Yeah, okay. So what is an ICO? Bob creates a token. Maybe the token is real or not. Maybe it has utility or not. They go and sell that token, and they raise some money, and they have a big pool of capital. So we'll put our pool of capital right here. I'm getting a lot of use out of this table, by the way. And so the capital's here, and what happens? You spend it. Eventually you run out of capital. So then how do you continue the project after the money runs out? Who's responsible for that? It's an open question, and as these ICOs run out of capital, it's going to become a persistent concern. So sustainability is the final component. You know, you have scalability, how do we get to billions of people? You have interoperability, how do we talk to thousands of tokens? And you have scale and sustainability, which is how do you make decisions about where to go so we don't have irreconcilable differences result in Bitcoin XXX, Bitcoin XXY, Bitcoin XXZ, and so forth. And then how do we actually pay for stuff? So given those three parameters, I think we're due for a new generation. You know, when we went from dumb transactions to smart transactions, it was so significant, we could say, okay, Ethereum really is the next generation of this stuff. And now we're going from smart transactions to systems that are eventually going to scale to millions to billions of people. We need to have the ability to have interoperability, scalability, and sustainability there. So I say that any blockchain that tries to do these things in whole is worthy of that title. So how do you do these things? You know, do you just like shake some bingo balls and put some words together in a white paper and claim you have? Well, no. They're actually quite simple conceptually. So for scalability, think of BitTorrent. Anybody has ever used BitTorrent before? Show of hands. BitTorrent's a really scalable protocol. So you'll notice something. If you go and download Game of Thrones, it's very popular. So you suddenly get Game of Thrones really quickly. Or if you download Pee-wee's Playhouse, I checked it this morning just for example, downloads very slowly. Apparently it's not as popular as Game of Thrones. Go figure, people have no taste. So what does this mean? Well, it means that your speed, performance, quality is proportional to the amount of people who are using the network. In other words, as people join, it's not like adding people around a table. It's like every person coming is bringing their own pie and putting it on the table for everybody else to have. They're going to eat some of it, but they give some of it to everybody else. So as you gain users, you gain capabilities. It's like an inverted pyramid in a certain sense. It's really good. So it would be really nice if cryptocurrencies had this characteristic. And you have three dimensions for those characteristics. One, you have transaction processing. So you may hear all these people say, like, I have 100,000 transactions per second or whatever. Well, maybe they do, maybe they don't. But the point there is that you want to have a system that scales so as you gain more users and consensus, you get faster TPS. Okay, there's two other dimensions though. One dimension is network. It doesn't really matter if you can go at 100,000 transactions per second. Well, that would require like gigabit fiber optic cable in your house to be able to transmit that amount of data. And then by extension, if it's hopping and gossiping throughout this network, no one could ever stay synchronized with it if everybody has to gossip and everybody has to have the same view of the data. So you have to shard the network as well. You have to figure out a way, how do I build a network where as I add people, I gain more network capabilities. And then finally you have data. So where do you put all of it? Let's say you do have 100,000 transactions per second. Let's say they're a kilobyte each. Is that 100,000 kilobytes? So that's 100 megabytes every second. So like every 10 seconds you have a gigabyte. My math is right. Been flying a lot. And then, you keep going up and up that chain. Well, what does that mean? It's like your blockchain is going to be petabytes. So who's going to store all that? These are replicated systems. The security property is that everybody has a copy of the blockchain. If only Bob, who owns the Googleplex, can store the blockchain, you do not have a decentralized system. So scalability requires you to actually innovate in all three of those areas. You have to figure out, how do I increase my transaction processing rate as I gain people, so I gain enough resources to cover all of the transaction demands these people have? How do I shard my network so I can move around these petabytes of data without having everybody gossip everything? And then how do I break my blockchain apart in a way kind of like how BitTorrent does, or something like that? Maybe he has some ideas. And that allows me to have this petabyte, yottabyte scale system, but I only have to possess maybe a little chunk of it, like 100 megabytes or 200 megabytes or something like that. And I still use the system and still have good security guarantees. So conceptually, that's what scalability is all about. How do you solve that in practice? Good crypto, good distributed system theory, and using better network protocols like RENA, for example. And that's what we do. We think about those things, and we go through peer review, and we hope we solved it. Okay, get a little feedback here. So then there's two other pillars, this interoperability, and then there's sustainability. So interoperability is just about, how do you build protocols that talk to other protocols? And this is not a new idea, it's a real old idea. It's the boring one of the three. So you have things like interledger, you have things like metadata, you have things like attributions, so an identity space. And it's easy to solve. It's an engineering problem, and it's something that you can solve through consensus and standards. So who cares about that? Where it gets interesting, though, is actually compressing views of other blockchains so that you can look at them without possessing the entire blockchain and still know that what you're seeing is correct. So this is, again, not a new idea. If you look at Bitcoin itself, what's in the block header? You have Merkle tree, right? Merkle root. What does the Merkle root give you the ability to do? I can give you a block body, and you have the Merkle root, and you're able to verify that body's correct. Merkle root's really tiny, and that body can be very big, right? It should be as big as you want. Still the same size at the top. That's called an authenticated data structure. That's the most primitive way of verifying things. But there's next generation things that people are coming up with that allow you to gain a view into a blockchain. You'll see sidechains research. For example, we published a paper recently called Non-Interactive Proofs of Proof of Work. And basically a bunch of gobbledygook for how to create zero-knowledge proofs with skip lists and all these other things so that you can take a compressed view of a blockchain, you can get a transaction from it, and just from that compressed view, verify that that transaction has not been double spent and it does actually exist and it's legitimate. But you don't have to have the whole chain to verify it. You have a strong probabilistic guarantee of that. Good crypto. So these types of things are going to become more pervasive, and as the cryptography gets more advanced, you'll gain more capabilities for blockchain interoperability. The legacy systems, you'll have to use metadata and root of trust. That's okay. Finally, there's sustainability, and this is what Tezos is all about, and a lot of these guys like Dash and so forth, they focus on this a lot. So sustainability is all about consent, okay? It's about voting. So first we have to decide who gets to vote. So imagine having an election where you say, okay, well, there's 1,000 people on the ballot. Look how accessible this is. Everybody's on the ballot. Oh, and by the way, only Charles gets to vote. Is this a fair election? No. Okay, so what do you need? You need to have a system where you have fair representation of people. But then, even if you represent everybody, what if you have to do 100 things to vote? It's very time-consuming. It's very painful. What does that mean? It means that you're not going to do it. So your participation rate goes really, really low. So who gets to vote, your incentives to vote, are very important, and there's something that need to be covered, in addition to ballot access. And then what can you put on the ballot? So can you just put improvement proposals, like a Bitcoin improvement proposal, a Cardano improvement proposal, whatever it have you? And how does it actually get accepted? What are the thresholds there? How long does that have to be? Those types of periods. So it's basically a democracy problem, if you think about sustainability in a certain lens. Because the same type of mechanism that can allow you to decide on one improvement over another improvement, like should we adopt segregated witness or not? Should we adopt quantum immune signatures or not? Can be used for funding ballots. For example, what if you take some of the money from the miners? Every time you produce a block, you get 12.5 coins with Bitcoin right now. So let's take that half. Just put it into a big bank account, a decentralized bank account that's controlled by the blockchain. It's like a DAO. And then say, okay, anybody can submit a ballot to this thing. Anybody. And so you want to start your own conference. It's going to be Crypto St. Kitts All right, it's going to be fun on the beach, free margaritas for everybody, and anybody can come, no tickets, it's being paid for by the blockchain. So people vote for that. If it gets approved, we can take money out and give the Bitcoin to you. That's simple. Dash pioneered that method. It's a pretty interesting idea. We wrote a very extensive paper on it. There's some good, some bad, and some ugly. We've also have a paper coming out from Lancaster University on liquid democracy. It's a coercion-resistant liquid democracy paper for what we think is a really good delegated way of doing voting. So, you just have to figure out how do you want to do the voting and how do you do the balloting and what can you put on the ballot. Finally, if you're going to do protocol upgrades, how do you represent the protocol upgrades? There's an ontological question there. What do you really mean by, like, vote? Can the protocol understand its own specification? How does that work? It's a very complicated, deep question. That's why Tezos is really hard. We're really looking forward to seeing that network if it works. So we can study it and learn from it. So that's what the Cardano project is all about. We have some solutions and some answers for each of these buckets, and there are other people who claim they do as well. EOS claims they do, Tezos claims they do, and some of them are more focused towards performance and scalability, and some of them are more performance or oriented towards governance. Some of them, like Ripple, are really pushing interoperability, and that's kind of their thing, and they really want to live in that space, and that's the third generation that we live in. And anybody who wants to create a third generation protocol, they have to kind of live in that space and have some baseline, and the market will pick winners and losers, and we're going to have a lot of fun figuring it all out. But one last point about this is that the complexity of these systems goes up an order of magnitude as you implement them. So Bitcoin's a very simple system. Its specification, its design, its concept can be written down in just a few pages. To prove this point, we wrote the ScoreX framework. It's only 4,000 lines of code in Scala, and it can completely replicate Bitcoin and more, okay? So if you can, in just a few thousand lines of code, specify something and actually have it run, that tells you that the design of this thing is not very complex. You go to Ethereum, you have a lot more code. You have a lot more complexity, because now you're managing state. Now you're managing inter-contract calls. You have a gas model, this notion of quasi-Turing stuff, metered computation. And you go to the next level, now you're talking about, like, how do I shard my space and make sure the shards talk to each other and I have high availability? You know, how do I do voting? You know, how do I do that? How do I talk to 1,000 different things and understand all this complex cryptography to make these things work? It's much more complicated. So my argument is, if we're moving into the third generation, the only way it's going to work is if we do our homework. We need to use peer review, and we need to use formal methods. Peer review, because the protocols are so complex and so subtle that it's very easy to make a mistake. And if you're smart, it's even easier to make a mistake, because you can hide your mistake with lots of complex math. And people say, hey, it looks right. It's got lots of math symbols in it. It's got to be right. This person is smart. Proof of solvent. And formal methods, because even if you go through peer review and you have great protocols, there's no guarantee that you've actually implemented them correctly. So that's Cardano in a nutshell. It's our attempt at a third generation protocol. We got 25 engineers on it, a bunch of scientists on it. I've been working on it for 2.5 years. Have a lot of fun. It just recently got released. The next version is Shelley. We name everything after poets at IOHK because we're hopeless romantics. And we've written a lot of papers. Love to have you guys read them. And I'd love to learn from you guys. So anybody have any questions? If we have time for questions. Yeah, you.
Let's start with the Q&A session, just for 10 minutes, because we have a double feature today. So,
thank you very much. I just have a little question about Ouroboros Prowls.
Yes, sir.
The most recent paper about Ouroboros. So what are the main advantages over the original Ouroboros system?
Okay, that's a great question. So first you have to have bedrock. So we can't even talk about Ouroboros, we talk about GKL 15. So Agalos Kiasas, he's our chief scientist, and Agalos, really bright guy. He's a very mathematician-oriented cryptographer. You can tell by the rigor in his papers. So when he came into the cryptocurrency space, he's like, I don't understand anything. That was the first thing he said. So first off, I need to understand if, like, Bitcoin is actually secure or not. So he said, screw proof of work, let's define a ledger, a secure ledger, as an abstract concept. And let's see if we can prove that Bitcoin satisfies all the properties that a secure ledger would require to have. So in 2015, he wrote a paper with Juan Garay and Nico Leonardis, and basically they defined that ledger, that secure ledger, And then they prove that proof of work actually creates a secure ledger. So Bitcoin's secure, yay, all right, good. But then it begs the question, what other consensus protocols could be secure and what assumptions do you have to have for that? So we designed Ouroboros amongst the same lines. We showed that assuming synchronization and assuming some characteristics about honest majority, you can create a secure ledger just as good as proof of work does. But the real world is not synchronous. The real world is a little bit messier. And so as a consequence, you need to relax that a little bit. And as a consequence, you need to make the protocol a little bit more resilient to real world use cases. So Ouroboros was the first generation to create a model to show that proof of stake is actually secure with honest majority. Kraus is the next generation where we start cleaning up things to make it much more realistic for real world use cases, for fast bootstrapping, for synthetic algorithmic weight, for semi-synchronicity, these types of properties. The problem is that when you want those types of things, you now have to introduce slightly more complicated cryptographic primitives. So for example, we have to use forward secure signature schemes and pseudorandom functions and these types of things to be able to accomplish that. But once they're put in, you get those, now you start looking a lot like proof of work, but you don't pay the proof of work price. And that's the point of Ouroboros and why we love it so much. The other difference is Ouroboros-Praus is our first attempt at formal verification for consensus algorithms. So when we implemented Ouroboros for Cardano, we wrote it in Haskell. We looked really carefully at the code for like a long time, and then we brought in like crazy Russian people to look really carefully at the code for a long time. And then we brought some Germans in just because we said, why not? And then they just came to a consensus the code is right. Well, it probably is okay, but we said we want to take it up a step and actually do a formal spec. So Praus, we actually have a repo. If you look at Ouroboros spec, you'll see Haskell with scicalculus embedded in it, and then we put in something called delta Q for network performance, and then we extract it to Isabelle. And we're actually able to prove statements about it in Isabelle. So it's going to be our first attempt at formal methods for the protocol itself. And it's actually been pretty fun. Our poor cryptographers have been beaten up because they assume things like ideal functionality, and you can't do that in the specifications. So they say, what do you mean by this? And they have these long, very pedantic, deeply technical, exhausting conversations every day. And like, we don't normally do this for our papers. It's been submitted to Eurocrypt. The original Ouroboros was submitted to Crypto. It got accepted to Crypto 17, and we hope it gets accepted to Eurocrypt for Eurocrypt 18. Praus is not going to be the end-all be-all. There's more work to do. After Praus is done, we have to get all the economic incentives completely fine-tuned. We also have to get that synthetic algorithmic weight, so you can just start with the Genesis block and be able to deterministically bootstrap like you do with proof of work. And then finally, we have to shard it. So we know how to do that, but we have to build a nice security model for the sharding, and that takes quite a bit of time. There's already some ideas like Bizcoin and Elastico and so forth that show how you can increase committee sizes. And the reason we use epochs in Ouroboros is you can run them in parallel. So right now it's just epoch 0, then epoch 1, then epoch 2, but there's no reason you can't do epoch 0 to epoch n. And you have different committees for each, and then you shard your transactions through that. But then you have to handle inter-shard communication, which is another thing we're trying to figure out. Yes?
Just maybe two developments for 2018 that you feel are important, if you would highlight that.
Well, one thing that's really exciting to me is the emergence of directed acyclic graphs. I mean, you see IOTA and hash graph, and it's not a new idea. We had it with Ethereum. We had, what was it, Ghost. We had the greediest heavy subtree, or something like that. And now there's Spectre, which is the replacement for Ghost. So there's a lot of good ideas there, and it's basically how do we massively increase transaction processing capability if we reduce block intervals and manage that. So I think that's going to be fun to explore, getting away from blockchain and moving into kind of a new notion of how data ought to be stored and managed. The other thing is chain interoperability protocols like sidechains are starting to come into their own. Like our non-interactive proofs of proof of work paper is pretty amazing. You look at the paper, you can see the space reduction for SPV clients. So we go from you can go from a 5 gigabyte store that you normally have to have, and you can have the same level of security with like 50 megabytes. Pretty amazing for like clients to say like on my cell phone, I can have like the same degree of certainty my full node has. So I'm really excited about seeing that stuff roll out. The other things are going to be like slow creepers. And it might not be 2018, it might be 2019, 2020, but multi-party computation trusted hardware is coming. And boy, that stuff is amazing, guys, because you can now do stuff off-chain. And it is very scalable because you eat what you kill.
So if you, for example, want to do a poker game off-chain, we have a protocol for this called Kaleidoscope. We created it out of Tokyo Tech. So you have a bunch of people come together, they're playing poker with each other. They use the blockchain as a trusted bulletin board. It's just off in the distance. It's used for a few things, but not very taxing things. All the poker stuff is happening in a private, low latency personal network between the players, and when they're done, they take their proofs and they go and redeem their winnings and losses on chain. There's an entry point and an exit point for the players, but all the stuff outside of that is off scope, and it's not constrained to the block interval or any of the dynamics of the blockchain structure. That's one thing. But that very same technology could be abstracted to a decentralized exchange or many other applications to run off-chain. So MPC is cool. The problem with MPC has always been performance, but now the newest protocols are linear time, so it's really exciting. Trusted hardware is miracle land. And this is one of those examples where people tried to screw you, but they accidentally gave you something cool. So content creators like Sony and all these other guys went to Microsoft and the other guys and they said, we need DRM. This internet thing is killing our business. Because like people can just copy our shit at any time. So can you create like rental keys and other things and store them in a trusted hardware enclave so that the enclave can guarantee the key is going to be deleted and all these other things, and software licenses can live in there and you can't tamper with it because it's an enclave? They say, sure, we can do that. So ARM Trust Zone exists and Intel SGX exists and all these other things. There's no reason you can't use those to manage Bitcoin keys and other things. You say, but why, Charles? Why would I care about that? Well, here's why. You can do offline off-chain payments. How do you do that? You create a special address that only lives in an enclave. You load it as a proof that it's been loaded. Then you can transfer that private key from one enclave to another enclave over Bluetooth and get a proof that it's been destroyed in the other enclave. And because it's trusted hardware and trusted hardware can't lie, you know there's only one copy of it and it's only existing on one phone at any given period of time. So you look at the blockchain, did a transaction happen? No. Nothing happened. You're just moving private keys around, right? So it's off-chain. And also, we did it over Bluetooth. We didn't need internet for that, so it's offline. This is like the most private thing you could ever do. There's like no tracking or anything, right? So trusted hardware gives you that capability, amongst many others. If you look at T-Chan, for example, it's a protocol out of Cornell for running payment channels on trusted hardware. Amin Gunseer is getting 173,000 transactions per second on an unoptimized T-Chan protocol. If you optimize that, you probably take it into the millions. And then state channels are only across the corner for smart contracts. So those are, I think, going to be big. We're working on it at Cardano. We have labs. Tokyo Tech is MPC, and trusted hardware is being done at Edinburgh. But it has a long spooling time. It takes about 12 months to 24 months to pull these things in. One thing about trusted hardware, though, you have to be careful about is that your root of trust is with the hardware vendor. So you can actually have protocol lock-in. So when you write these protocols, they're signed by Intel or signed by ARM, example, and then they run on those trusted cores. ARM won't sign a fork. So if we had an Ethereum and an Ethereum Classic situation, Ethereum would keep the key. Ethereum Classic actually wouldn't get it, even though it's the same technology. So just one little thing is that you're starting to get vendor lock-in when you have trusted hardware, but MPC you don't, because that's completely software. Next question.
Next one.
Come on, kids. Came all the way to Switzerland. I was at a rodeo in Las Vegas. I was watching cows get roped. Well, they were little cows, or bulls.
Okay, so I have a short question from a corporate point of view.
Sure.
I deal a lot with governance, compliance, ALM topics on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm.
You see in the future, in the near future, I'm still new to this whole environment, do you see any protocols that come out of it that would standardize like controls that you usually have like around access or around change to make sure that that is actually proof of peer-to-peer reviews to automate that in a certain way,
right?
Make sure that this is accurate and complete.
So yeah, it's a great question. It's a very involved, detailed question. So I can give you a surface answer because we don't have enough time to go into every tentacle of it. But in general, one direction to go into is how much governance can you put on blockchain, and what does blockchain give you? So generation 1 blockchain gives you auditability and timestamping and immutability. These are your 3 characteristics, which are great because you know when it was put in, you know who it put in, and nobody can go and tinker with that record. And from an auditor's perspective, they love that, right? It's great. So then next generation gives you programmability with some of those characteristics. So there's a lot of projects floating around. Like I think Consensus has Project Brooklyn or something, where they're talking about if you want to do an ICO, can you move some of the governance behind the use of funds and who gets to spend and how they spend and how those controls are working into a set of standardized smart contracts, much like we have an ERC20 token. Now we have like a smart contract funding stack, a standard stack. And then when you do a crowd sale, you're no longer making that bespoke for your sale. Instead, you're parameterizing it. Like ERC20, you decide how many tokens do I want to have. So similarly, you'll say how long is the vesting period and how many signatories are going to be there and so forth. So once those things get standardized, then you can build insurance markets and regulations around those standards. Because you can go to the regulator and instead of saying to them, by the way, it's completely new, it's crazy, there's weird neck-bearded people running around doing crazy things, figure it out. You say, I know it's hard, but here's a solution, and it's a pretty good one. What would you like to change about this? And they could talk around it and eventually come to a compromise and say, this is the regulated ERC20 and the regulated crowd sales stack. Now, the other direction is AML, KYC, compliance. Every bank has to deal with that. Trusted hardware, going back to that, you can now talk about managing credentials in trusted hardware. So you can have a hash of the credentials that's signed by your trust authorities. So that could be Accenture or PwC or whoever is doing your auditing. And then you can have the actual credentials live in a trusted hardware net. And they only move around the trusted hardware net. So when you do need to reveal and show these things, there's a way to do that, and there's an elevation of authority that can occur. But because it's being done within trusted hardware, you have determinism within that process. And in this case, you're marrying two things together. You know, a rich capability platform with a blockchain. And any blockchain would do for that. Ethereum would do for that. Bitcoin would do for that, and so forth. So there's been some innovation and progress there, and a lot of people are thinking about how do we do that, especially in identity management, like how do we build a proper identity system and so forth, which is hard. It's not hard to do identity, it's hard to do revocation, and it's hard to do reputation. Those are always the hard things, like where do you get your trust roots from as well. And there's a few other directions you can go into it, but that's, I think, for the next 3 years, where most of the market is going to focus, is realizing that they now have this database that's always honest, and we now have this hardware that's always honest. Given that it's always honest and they can be admissible, what can we build on top of that? And then how much of these processes can we standardize and automate? And then once they're standardized and automated, let's build insurance markets and let's build regulation standards around those types of things. And then they kind of basically become the way things work. If you look at most finance, usually it's self-regulation. Right? There's always some voluntary standards, and if you get too egregious, then the criminal stuff comes in. But for the most part, it's handled within the voluntary side of things. Make sense? Okay. All right, I think I've used all my time. Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
This is a lot of fun.
Great to have you
Thank
here.
You guys.